Ata Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asuk b'divrei Torah. Barivna Adonai Eloheinu et divrei Toratcha b'finu v'pivcha beit Yisrael. V'niyeh anachnu v'tzetzinu v'tzetzem beit Yisrael. Kulanu yodea shemecha v'lomdei Toratech lishma. Baruch atah Adonai l'mei Torah l'mo Yisrael.
Amen.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher b'chabanu mikol hamim v'natan lanu Torato. Baruch atah Adonai noten Torah.
Amen.
Amen.
Okay. So, guys, I just want to take this opportunity to thank you for joining me on our learning journey together as fellow Kuvrusas. And you guys have done a lot. And obviously, I know some of you have had a lot going on and you haven't been able to attend all the shirim. But let's just think, if you've only attended 100 out of the 140 and you've done no prep whatsoever, it still means you've done 4,000 minutes instead of 7,000 with a bit of prep, 10 minutes of prep. Yeah. So where else would you have put in that discipline for yourselves? So I thank you guys all, even those that have had a little bit of hiccups along the way. I want to thank you all. I'm very proud of all of you, really. It's been very nice to learn with you. It's some days when I don't feel like learning, you guys help edge me on, and I'm sure sometimes you don't feel like it, but at least we all pull each other to the finish line. It might not be Daf Yomi in terms of the pace, but we're getting a comprehension of understanding everything properly, not just having this, what you call it, this sense of seeing a train whiz past you. And I really, really appreciate you all learning with me. Thank you, really.
Cool.
Thanks for teaching us so well.
Guys, I think I'm putting us on IMDb now because we're on 140 series, season 2.
Yes, that's right.
We can start on thing on IMDb for the Bava Kamma shows.
That's true. We're on season 2 almost.
Yeah. So, chapter 1, chapter 2.
So what we covered yesterday, just quickly, I'll tell you where we are. All right, we on 22b1, and the Gemara challenges Reish Lakish from another source. Come line approved from the following Mishnah, and that Mishnah, as we said, is in 61b. If one set fire to a stack of grain, and there was a goat bound to the stack of grain, and a slave was near it, and they burnt with it, he, the one who set fire, is liable to pay for the kid goat in the stack. It's saying here not for the slave, because a person that's not tied down has the capacity to escape. However, if a slave was bound and tied to the stack, and the kid goat was near it, and they were burnt with it, he, the one who set the fire, is not liable to pay for the destruction of the stack and the kid goat, because it results from his act of murder. So what we learned yesterday is kimle b'dirabba minne, which means if you're culpable of murder and at the same time you've created an act of financial liability, you only have to pay the more severe of the two payments if it's done as a simultaneous act. Because just like there were two death penalties, one only has to pay for the one more severe death penalty, which is almost an umbrella kapora for the lesser crime. Okay, so now this is the challenge. The Gemara now explains its challenge. This is the second ruling of the Mishnah, and it's understandable according to the one who says that one is liable for fire on account of it being deemed his arrows, because it's for this very reason that he's not liable to pay for damages in this case. So what it's saying is that the reason why you're not liable for financial damages is that if you set fire to a stack of grain and somebody was bound up and they couldn't escape and they died in it, that's a case of murder. And since that person is culpable, that arsonist who set the fire to of murder, he's no longer eligible to pay the financial damages, since he's going to lose his life with the death penalty. So that makes sense according to Rav Yochanan, who says a fire is deemed one's arrows, meaning that if you set the fire, it's almost like you're shooting an arrow or a projectile, and you set um, into motion a particular series of events which has caused this person's murder. So you don't have to set light to the actual slave itself, merely to flammable material around him to be able to render the act of murder. And then this also supports Rav Yochanan in a second way, is that Rav Yochanan deems culpability of fire for a person's arrows, meaning his force. He set it alight in his yard, it went to his neighbor, and therefore is also responsible. According to Reish Lakish, the second criteria, apart from direct contact, is that fire is deemed one's property. And just like one is responsible for guarding their property against damaging others, so fire is considered like guarding one's ox or one's pit against damaging others. Therefore, if your ox kills a Canaanite slave, you are liable to a 30 shekel payment of silver shekels. Why? Because you did not kill the Canaanite slave. Again, doesn't matter what nation we're from, if one human being kills another human being, they're liable for the death penalty on direct damage. If one's property kills a human being, you're liable for the correct payment according to that particular category. In this particular category of a Canaanite slave, it's 30 shekel pieces. So we're saying very clearly that if it's one's fire, and it's according to Reish Lakish, he deems that it's one's property. And if we take an example of an ox, like we learned before, killing a Canaanite slave, that's 30 shekel pieces. So we learned there the difference, that the halacha is very severe in terms of the severity difference between Rav Yochanan and Rav Reish Lakish. So we can see it's not just a minor difference in terms of how it plays out. So the Gemara is basically saying, but according to the one who says that one is liable for fire on account of it being deemed his property, why is he not liable for damages? Now the Gemara is asking a different question. It says, okay, we can understand that Rav Reish Lakish deems the fire the property, and that's why he is liable for financial damages, right? Because he hasn't created an act of murder. What's actually happened is the fire, which is deemed his property, indirectly has killed a bound slave. Now, don't get me wrong. In Shemaim, Hashem knows exactly what is going on and will hold that person accountable for murder. But there's something known as groma, which is indirect, an indirect killing. So, say for example, you make sure somebody falls in a pit, and they don't die in the pit, but you don't give them food and water, and they die of malnutrition or of exposure to the elements. Now, that's not considered a direct death that you caused them. It's as a result of you not helping them. So Hashem will hold you accountable, but the base din doesn't hold you accountable for groma in that case. So according to Reish Lakish, the Gemara wants to ask, why are they not holding accountable to pay financial damages? Because it says, if his bull had killed a slave, would he also not be liable to make its monetary payment? So what it's asking is here, is that if according to Reish Lakish's opinion, that this is not a case of murder, but merely his property damaging, why then does Reish Lakish, how would he answer this Mishnah? Because again, what does this Mishnah say in 61b? It turns around and says, exactly as we read, that if a slave was bound to the stack and a kid goat was near it and they were burnt with it, the one who set the fire is not liable to pay for the destruction of the stack and kid because it results in the act of murder. So we're saying, according to Reish Lakish, who doesn't hold it as murder, why doesn't he make you liable to pay? Because if he says you're not responsible for murder, then you do have to pay. Then the law of Kim Labati Rabbi Minay doesn't apply. So the Gemara is asking this question on Reish Lakish. How would he answer this particular mission? And the answer is addressed as follows. Guys, I'm hearing a background noise. I think it might be coming from Kevin's computer actually, because they're doing construction. Or is it Gavin? Maybe it's Gavin.
Yes,
Gav,
now you can mute me. I don't have any noise. I started.
okay. All right. I'm just going to mute you. If you have any questions, guys, you just go off. Now, the Gemara answers as follows. Rav Shimon ben Lakish, which is Reish Lakish, would say to you in his own defense, with what case are we dealing here? In the Mishnah, where he set fire to the slave's very person. For in that case, he has certainly committed an act of murder, and he therefore stands subject to the penalty greater than payment. Therefore, the Mishnah absolves him from paying. So what it's saying is, okay, Reish Lakish would deem that an act of murder could be created if somebody, for example, doused the slave with kerosene, which is a flammable material, and took a match and set the slave alight. That is direct contact on contact murder from one human being to another. And since the arsonist is liable to the murder, because it's not like he set a stack of grain alight and he burnt the slave directly, he is not eligible to the financial payment because he is going to be given the death penalty. So that's how Reish Lakish would answer the particular Mishnah. So then the Gemara says, if that is so, then the Mishnah speaks of where he set fire to the slave's person, which means directly on the slave. Then what need was there for the Mishnah to say this ruling? Isn't it obvious? In other words, the Mishnah is saying the Gemara is saying we've learned in many Mishnayos when a human being damages a human being directly is subject to the death penalty. So Reish Lakish, if that is your answer, what is the need for this Mishnah? In other words, every Mishnah that occurs has to teach us principles. If it doesn't teach us a principle, it's redundant. So therefore, according to your answer, it would seem as though the Mishnah had no purpose. So unless you can answer what purpose the Mishnah had, the answer doesn't fit. In other words, even if it fits, what is the Mishnah teaching you? It has to teach you something in addition to just fit snugly. So this is what Reish Lakish would say. It'd say the Gemara answers, no, it's actually necessary to teach this ruling where the kid goat belongs to one person and the slave belongs to another. So let's just discuss here what we're talking about that it's actually going to teach.
Damon?
So there's a principle of the Kimle B'dirabba Mineh, which means he stands liable to the greater penalty, absolves the murderer from monetary payment for the kid goat. Now, even though he incurs the death penalty for something completely unrelated to the owner of the kid goat. This is according to Rashi and Tosfot's explanation of Reish Lakish. So he said you could understand the Kimle in an act where the person had the slave working for him and he had the kid goat that he owned. And since it's one person that basically had these two articles or people or property under him, you would say that that makes sense. In other words, since you killed his slave and that you're liable for the death penalty, then you certainly don't have to pay for damaging his kid goat because you're going to suffer at the hands of the death penalty. But what it's saying here is something very interesting, something different. Reish Lakish, brought by Rashi and Tosfot, is saying that what it's teaching you is if the ownership is different, the one owner still can't claim from the arsonist. Meaning, one person owned the kid goat, a separate person owned the slave. And if the slave died as a result of the arsonist, the kid goat's owner, who had nothing to do with the slave that ended up dying in this attack, cannot claim from the arsonist the money because the arsonist now is subject to the death penalty. Now, before this Mishnah came along, all we understood is if the issues were involved with each other, that the person doesn't is let off the hook financially. But here we're learning in cases, unfortunately, that's what you call a casualty, is that if another person was damaged financially in a separate case that happened simultaneously from the same act, where the arsonist is now, or the protagonist is now going to get the death penalty for what he caused, none of the parties can claim financially. That's what Reish Lakish is saying that this mission is coming to teach. Okay. Have I all got your attention, guys? Can you unmute yourself so I can just see if there are any questions?
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Why? Just Damon, but I wanted to ask another question.
Sure.
You're saying that the arsonist deliberately murdered the slave, he lit him, or it was unintentional?
Yes, I mean, obviously, in a case of unintentional,
Yeah, so then
the case is in. It's not. Kevin's asking a good question. He's saying, does one still get the? Let me see if I understand your question. I'm not sure.
But I want to ask another thing about the Ira Miklat. With the Ira Miklat, would you be able to go to the Ira Miklat in that case or not?
That's what I was asking. That's what I was asking. So, Kevin, are you asking the following? Are you asking what happens in a case of accidental murder as opposed to purposeful murder? Is that what you're asking? I just want to see what you're asking.
Yeah. Would he be and then if he went to the city of refuge, would he still be liable for the death of that of that slave?
Okay, so Kevin is asking a brilliant question. Kevin is asking, in a case, let's use a different example of this. The classic case in Makot. So Makot is when there's a case where basically there's an axe, and what happens is the guy lifts up the axe, and as he lifts up the axe to chop wood, the handle comes off and tonks somebody on the head and splits their head open, and that person dies. Now that is an accidental murder, and what happens is now this person has to the city of refuge, because the family, if they catch up to him, are entitled to kill him, because so he has a certain period of time. He's got like a head start where he can go to the city of refuge, and when he goes to the city of refuge, he has to stay there until the Kohen Gadol dies. And the reason why he has to stay there till the Kohen Gadol dies is because on some level the Kohen Gadol is responsible. And you might say, why? Because in a generation where the Kohen Gadol was holding at the highest level, there weren't such a thing as accidental deaths, because they had divine protection. I mean, there was a case in the Gemara where a person was mauled by a lion in a forest, and the one rabbi didn't want to speak to one of the other leaders of the generation, I think for 3 days, because everybody thought it was an accident that this guy was mauled by a lion. Just one of the members of Klal Yisrael. But the two leaders of the generation, the one leader knew that the other one, his level wasn't very high, and because he never protected his generation in terms of that spiritual divine protection, because he dropped his level, such a thing could happen. In other words, when you're holding at a very high spiritual level, like at the time of Moshe Rabbeinu, is that people would have divine protection. So therefore, certain accidental murders and other cases where nature, inverted commas, would take its course would not occur. And that's why the mother of the Kohen Gadol had to come to the city of refuge, and she would give gifts and food and drink and look after the prisoners in the city of refuge. Because why? Their davening, somebody's davening is so powerful that in their sheer state of depression, if they prayed that they'd get out of jail, and the only way that they could get out of what you call jail, it wasn't jail, it was a city of refuge where all these accidental murderers were residing in, the only way they could get out of it is if the Kohen Gadol died. So what happens is they would daven that they'd get out of it. It's not that they wanted the Kohen Gadol to die. It's just nobody wants to be incarcerated. And because even the prayers of somebody that might have committed murder, if said sincerely, have merit because they've done good things in their life as well, and this was not purposeful murder, they were worried that the Kohen Gadol might die. Why? Because if you've got 1,000 people in the cities of refuge, all praying they're going to get out, Hashem's hearing listen, we want to get out. The Kohen Gadol needs to go. We want to get out. We want to get out. And it's not going to have a good impact on his lifespan. So what the mother would do generally, no, it's brought in the Gemara, is she'd come over and placate them and build a bit of a relationship with them so that it's very difficult to wish somebody any sort of ill or death when you've got a relationship with that person's mother who would lose their son as a result. So what it did is it took the edge off their davening so that they would fulfill their sentence as designated in Shemaim, that people have to suffer in this world so they don't suffer in the next. And that's why she fed them. So Kevin's question was very good. Kevin is saying, what happens in this case of the arsonist? So is this a case where he goes to the city of refuge, or is this a case where they get the death penalty? Both according to Reish Lakish's explanation and Rav Yochanan, he would get the death penalty. Let me explain to you why. Again, there's one thing if the blaze is caught and a slave doesn't escape and is not tied down. Say he doesn't escape in time. You're not liable to the death penalty because that is accident. It's very difficult to call it an accident when the guy's got duct tape and going, and he's tied to the stack of grain. It's not an accident. The timing is just too perfect. So in that particular case, he doesn't go to the city of refuge. He gets the death penalty. It's not exactly CSR forensics like they do now that they can pick up a swab and realize that there was some rope bought from Builder's Warehouse. It's not at that level of sophistication. But the point of it is, you can see if there were remnants of rope. How do you see if there are remnants of rope? If there wasn't a total burn and the guy died of asphyxiation. I don't know if you know this, but most murders, most fire deaths occur in a lung asphyxiation. There's pulmonary buildup where there's a lack of oxygen, and that's where a person dies. Very few people get crispy. That's how most people die. They can't escape, and they sometimes hide in water or their bath or on ground level where they don't get burnt, but they're not getting sufficient oxygen. So when you look at a body and you see rope burns where they were tied, and then they've got that expression that they can't have oxygen in their mouths, it's a pretty good indication they were tied up, just as a matter of interest. So that is certainly not accidental, and that's why they're liable to the death penalty. All right. So Kevin, well answered. Okay, in order to have a case in which the death of the slave exempts the murderer from monetary payment to something other than the slave's owner, the Mishnah had to introduce the factor of a kid belonging to someone else. Okay. Why? Because we need to see that any financial damage caused by different parties where the protagonist is going to get the death penalty, in that case, every financial charge is waived and dropped against him, even if they're different parties. That's what we had to learn from this Mishnah. All right. Anybody else have any questions?
No, good.
All right. So let me just continue. We've got a few minutes. The Gemara challenges Reish Lakish from a different source. Okay, it says, come learn a proof from a Mishnah in 59b, and it says, if one sets a blaze through a deaf mute, a mentally deranged person, or a minor, he's not liable to pay under the laws of man, but he is liable to pay under the laws of heaven. Okay, so this is the same concept as what we discussed before, is that Hashem knows somebody's level of negligence and intent, and although we can't always prosecute on earth for certain indirect crimes, etc., Hashem knows exactly what's going on. So that's why it says the person is liable to pay under the laws of heaven, but they can't make him pay under the laws of man. Now, we're not talking about homicide anymore. We are talking about this particular Mishnah in 59b, where it said, if an arsonist set ablaze through a deaf mute, a mentally deranged person, or a minor. Now here, I wouldn't even say we're talking about the category of an arsonist. We're talking about a new category here. We're talking about a category where a person was just stupidly negligent. and they gave the fire, and we've touched on this stuff before, to somebody that had no business being handed a fire. Why? Because a minor cannot see consequence of action, neither deranged person. And when they use the term a deaf mute, they're not, I don't think they're talking about a deaf mute as we say, somebody's inability to speak and hear, because that person is mentally competent. What they're referring here to a deaf mute instead of a mentally deranged person is a person with mental retardation that isn't a, what do you call it? People that are, I watch this program like severely autistic or retarded, are non-verbals. They don't have the capacity to speak, so you can't process what they're processing, meaning you don't know if they've understood instructions, you don't know if they've understood consequence. And in that case, if people cannot communicate to you and you suspect that there might not be the ability to test consequence of action, you have no business giving them a fire. Now, when we learned the daf before, we were discussing a case of if one tied up a fettered ox, if one had a pit with a deaf mute to look after. Remember, we said there was a drain, a sewerage drain, and there was a drain cover. And then are you allowed to leave it for a deaf mute to cover? Or is he going to get curious and lift up the drain cover, and then cars are going to hit it like a pothole? And then we were talking about a fire. Now, if you remember what we were talking about before with the flame, we talked about a case where a flame started off as a coal, and it wasn't a hazard at that point, according to some opinions, because he would have to actively blow the coal into a fire in order to render it an active damager. Whereas with a fettered ox, an ox was tied and would continually try and pull loose, and therefore it was only a matter of time before the ox became a damager. So in the case of the ox, you gave somebody a damager that was going to damage. It was a matter of time, and they weren't competent enough to circumvent that and prevent the damage. And it said with a pit where you had a manhole and a cover, that because of the vibrations caused by animals and cars and people, that drain cover would start to lift and then not be secure. So it was like tying up a fettered ox, where it would eventually escape from the rope, or the vibrations would cause the lid on the sewerage hole to start to lift up on its own. Therefore, you're giving somebody that isn't competent a damaging timeline. Therefore, you're responsible. But with a piece of coal in a box, the Gemara deems that, according to most opinions, there was an opinion to the contrary, that a coal left on its own will eventually die out. And only if that person blows it and starts to stick flammable material will become a flame. And therefore, if you handed a deaf mute or a mentally incompetent or a minor an active flame, a ready flame, then in that case you're liable. But there was an opinion that if you handed a deaf mute a flame, that you weren't even liable in that case, because it was his action that directly caused and set fire to things. On a personal level, there's a difference between what they can prosecute, as we learned before, because it says you're responsible at the hands of heaven, but maybe not by court. And therefore, anybody that gives some sort of potential damager, even if it takes the deaf mute or deranged person's ingenuity to create it to an active damager, if you give it to this sort of person, you're liable under the hands of heaven, because you must yourself have rocks in your head to give such a damaging thing to somebody that's going to clearly cause it to be a disaster. I'm not going to go through this part of the Gemara any further today. I've just introduced the topic, but we've covered a lot of ground today. And well done, guys. I want to thank you all for your level of attendance. Stephen, it's lovely to see you too. Really, really, it's nice.
Can I ask a quick question that I've always wanted to ask?
Sure.
I actually meant to ask it in Sanhedrin as well. If you go to the Beth Din and you found guilty, right? It can be related to these cases as well. But if you found guilty of the death penalty and you serve and you get beheaded here, Are you then still culpable when you get to Shemayim, or are you off the hook?
Okay, it's a great question. I've got a minute to answer it. So the reality is the death penalty here offers an opportunity, only an opportunity to get Kippur in the next world. So, if you use that as an opportunity to consciously know that that is the reason, that it gives a person an opportunity to do that in this world in order that they don't have to suffer as severely in the next world. I don't know if it gets them off the hook totally. Then they've used that opportunity well, and it will deem an assistance for them in the next world. But if once they interviewed like Ted Bundy, who had no remorse for what he did, that kapara of the death penalty isn't going to help him at all, because he never used that opportunity to convert it into any sort of remorse. It has to be used in conjunction with remorse in order for it to have any
Right.
sort of effect in the next world.
So what I